Welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today is 3.3 Audio Effects, and this will be the last lesson of Module 3 on timbre, and it will also finish up Unit 1. Let's take a look at the schedule for today. Today we will be talking about audio effects. So for next time, you're going to do Quiz 2. That covers all of Module 3, including today's lesson. So that's acoustic instruments, electronic, and audio effects. So here are the basic kinds of effects that we'll be talking through today. Basic, amplitude or volume, time-based effects, modulation, and audio quality effects. All of this follows pretty closely to the audio effects reading that I created for us. And like with most of our readings and resources, there's more in here than you'll be tested on. There's just some extra info for those of you who want to work with, for example, compression. There's some good info about how to do that. But we will be highlighting the main stuff today and the basic effects that we all should know. So we can start by asking, what do audio effects do? So audio effects alter a live or recorded sound in a variety of ways. A good way to think about audio effects is think about a guitar pedal. So if you don't know what these are, when electric guitarist, when someone's playing an electric guitar, they can plug into one side of this and out the other side. This is a distortion pedal. So when we turn it on, the signal gets distorted, so the sound quality changes, the timbre changes. And we're going to be discussing in a bit what distortion is, but if you want to just think about what effects are, think about a guitar pedal. It's a simple way to think about it. You have an effect that you turn on or off, and then you have controls for how the sound is being affected and how much the sound is being affected. So here we have a tone, a level, and an amount of distortion. So you change these knobs based on what you want in the song. You turn the distortion on and off. So that's an example of an audio effect. Now we're going to start by first looking at basic effects. We can also do any of these on the computer. So I'm going to show using some of the instrumental sound samples from last lesson and the lesson before. So we're going to start trying out some effects, and you can follow along in the audio effects reading. First, let's take a listen to what we call the dry sound of these instruments. So I grabbed these from the previous lesson. We have a flute, violin, guitar, tai gong, and a square wave. Let's hear those again. So you might remember that these are all playing middle C, so they're playing the same note, and that helped us talk about the differences of their timbres. As usual, we can look at both the waveform up here in the green and the spectrogram down here. So because they have different timbres, the different effects will react differently with them. So we can see as we go through these examples how the different initial timbres are changed by the effects. So the first terms I wanted to mention that you'll see in the reading, let me zoom in here a little bit if I can, is wet versus dry. So the concept of wet and dry is just something you'll see on many or even all effects, and all it is the distinction of how much of the unaffected sound, or the dry, is mixed with how much of the affected sound, or the wet. So let's say, for example, we had a reverb and we were going to put a reverb effect on this sound. If we had 100% wet, then we would only hear this with reverb on it. If we had 50% wet and 50% dry, then we would hear a combination of what we just heard, the dry, with a half wet signal as well. So we would hear the unaffected mixed with the affected. So if you were trying to put an effect on a sound, this is a good distinction to make, whether you want it totally affected or some mix of the two. So that's wet and dry. The first effect in our basic effects category is a filter. A filter, also known as an EQ, is an effect that adjusts the amplitude of one or more ranges or bands of frequency, and that affects the timbre, making the sound brighter or darker. And we've been doing a little bit of filtering already. We read about the high pass, low pass, and band pass filters in the Stolet reading. But every time that we get into the audio spectrum here and change anything, we're filtering. So let's take, for example, just one of these sounds, the square wave. Right now, as we know, we're looking at frequency up and down. If I were to select the higher frequencies, we can hear just those. That's the high buzziness. If I were to delete that in this program, what I've done is filtered the sound by filtering out the highs. This would be what's known as a low pass filter. So I've let all the low frequencies pass through. Let's hear the square wave with a low pass filter, filtering out the high frequencies. So of course you could do the opposite and have a high pass filter where you filter out the lower frequencies. Now only the higher frequencies pass through. You can see it makes a pretty dramatic change to the sound. We haven't changed the pitch, nor have we changed the harmonics, but we've filtered some of them out. So we don't, of course, have to delete or turn them off altogether. I could, in this program, turn them down using this volume knob. I could turn down the low frequencies and still have them in there, but much quieter. Let's try that. You'll notice that the colors got darker there. So by cutting out or turning up or down certain ranges of frequencies, we are filtering the sound. So this spectrogram view is one way to do that. I could turn up these frequencies right here. I could take out one frequency. All of that is filtering the sound. Other ways to do that are with graphic filters. So you will see what are called band filters like this. So you see here a bunch of dials or sliders, and above them are a frequency range. So in the middle is 500 hertz. Up at the top is everything greater than 16,000 hertz. Down at the bottom is everything below 31 hertz. So you notice that does line up with our hearing range. Down here is 20 hertz and up here is 20,000 hertz. So we can take this same part here, the square wave, and use this filter to do some similar things. So let's say I wanted to do something like this. I turn down all the lows and I make a little bump in the middle and turn down all the highs. So now what I've done is essentially cut down the high and low frequencies and leave in the middle frequencies. So when I apply that filter, you can see here it's done that. Now the middle frequencies are, since it's logarithmic, are actually like in here because the lowest frequencies are actually kind of below this. So I think I'll do that again and make it more extreme so we can really see it better. So here's what I mean. If I take down these lows and make the bump up there, we'll see this a little bit clearer. Versus the original. That type of filter that we just did is common in mixing because it emulates how older recordings sounded, in the 1940s and 50s, where microphones were not very good at picking up the low or high frequencies, and speakers weren't very good at playing back the low and high frequencies. So what we got was a lot of the middle. Um, let's try that same filter on the whole sound here so we can hear it on the other instruments. That's versus this, which is the original. So of course you can do whatever you want with the filter. You can boost one thing way up, you can take something out, and anything you do with EQ is a filter. So there's one more type of view that you might see with a filter that would look like this. This is actually the same type of thing. Notice that this has frequency going left to right, not like in our spectrogram. So this is volume. It's kind of the reverse. So think about up here as the high frequencies. If I wanted to take out all the high frequencies, I might turn them down like this. So that's just another effect view for a filter. So filtering is one of the most important effects there is. It's involved in every recording, and it's probably the simplest and most direct way to affect the spectrum of sound by filtering the bands of frequencies or taking things higher or lower in volume at some points in the spectrum. The next type of basic effect that I'd like to talk about is pitch and time effects. So these two things are related because we know that pitch and time are connected. Think about the fact that a high pitch is actually a fast frequency. We've talked about that. So the frequency of 1,000 hertz is actually an oscillation in time that happens 1,000 cycles per second, versus a low pitch like 100 hertz, which oscillates at 100 cycles per second. So when we work with changing the pitch of a sound or the timing of a sound, how long it lasts, those two things are connected. So there are three related effects here that can shed some light on this. Starting with resampling. Now, some of these things have different names in different programs, but resampling is what we do when we want to change both the time and the pitch. So what we can do is play back the whole sound slower, and therefore it will be lower. Or we could play it back faster, and it will be higher. You're probably familiar with this concept if you've ever changed the speed on a turntable, or if you've ever had any kind of VHS or tape that accidentally played too fast or too slow. You notice that, like in a movie when when things go into slow motion visually, you also hear their voice go low. And so the lowness of the voice is because as time moves slower, pitch goes lower, and vice versa. So resampling is where we start, and that's where we change both the time and the pitch. So let's listen now to the violin here. And let's go ahead and I'll switch over to the waveform view. You notice that the violin lasts about a second and a half here. And the pitch, if we go back down to the spectrum, well, we remember it's a middle C, but probably you can't see this far over right now, but the pitch of a middle C is about 260 hertz. So we would see that's where this is right here. When we go to apply a resampling effect and stretch both time and pitch, This program gives me the option to lock, stretch, and pitch, which is what we want to do because we want to hear them both change. So I can change the length of the sound. Let's say I play it back at 200%. That changed the pitch down 12 half steps or an octave, which is the natural relationship between two pitches that are an octave apart. One is half the frequency of the other, and that's the same thing as going half the speed. So as I apply this effect, now we're going to see that our violin sound here is both twice as long, and the pitch is now, instead of 260 hertz, the pitch is now 130 hertz. So let's hear it. So this type of effect where you change pitch or speed, resampling could have a really smooth result. Let's listen to the gong really fast. What I mean by smooth result is that some sounds that you slow down are going to sound pretty realistic. So with the gong, what we've essentially done by playing this back at half speed is we've created a gong that's twice as big, and therefore creates a sound that is an octave lower. And our ears and brains understand that because this gong could have been bigger. Similarly with the violin, as it goes down an octave, it sounds pretty realistic, like it could have been a cello or a bass instead of a violin. Similarly with the synthesized sounds. But if we were to go more extreme and stretch everything even further, of course, we would get into the kind of unrealistic territory. So let's say I go to 800% of the length. So now we're going to have 8 times the length, and therefore many octaves below. Let's hear that. That's our violin. Here's what our flute sounds like. Here's our square wave. And here's our gong. So the results could be interesting or surreal or silly, depending on what we're doing. I think it's interesting that with the string sample, the violin is going so slow that now we're actually hearing the individual little grips of the bow. The rosin of the bow grabs the string over and over again extremely fast, like a little sawtooth, and we actually hear those now that it's this slow. And it's hard to hear the exact pitch. So we went really extreme there. Now I'm going to go back to the original, and we'll talk about the other two types of pitch and time shifting. So this type, first to close that out, resampling, because time and pitch are connected, when you do what we just did, there is absolutely no loss of quality in the audio. Now, it may sound weird or bad, but it is not glitching, and it's not necessarily sounding affected. It just sounds unreal. But all of the audio data is intact, and it's totally easy to do. This would just be like if we played back at a slower speed on an old tape or a record. But the other two types, pitch shifting and time stretching, is where the effect tries to do one but not the other, and therefore it is not going to be as high of quality. The resampling has perfect quality, audio quality. The pitch shifting and time stretching lose audio quality. So that's why I phrase this as the effect attempts to change pitch without affecting timing. So pitch shifting, if used subtly, can be pretty effective and unnoticeable. Like, for example, nowadays when people sing a little bit out of tune on an album, let's say they just were a quarter tone, just a tiny bit out of tune, and someone goes in digitally and retunes their note up by 50 cents, by just a little bit. We probably won't notice it because the timing difference would have only been a part of a second anyway, and so we hear it as being pretty realistic. But if we try to change the pitch drastically while leaving the timing the same, then we're going to hear sort of what we call artifacts or bad audio quality, because it's fighting against itself, trying to stay in the same timing while changing the pitch. Obviously, there are reasons if you're making music why you would want things to stay in time while only changing the pitch, and vice versa. But just know that there is a potential loss of quality. So in this program, what I would do to accomplish that is not lock the pitch and stretch. And I do know that probably it's difficult to see what's here, so just listen to my explanation and I'll tell you what's going on. So now we're going to stretch the pitch. Let's say we're going to move it down by 400. We're going to change the pitch by, let's say, down 2 octaves. But we're going to leave the timing the same. So now it's going to be back to a second and a half, but we're going to hear it 2 octaves down. Let's hear what that sounds like. Here's the violin. Here's the guitar. Here's the flute. And it actually sounds pretty good, but you can tell, it has the original timing and the pitch was changed. If we really wanted to demonstrate the loss of audio quality, I could go even more extreme, transposing even further down 3 octaves. You will probably hear just a little bit of kind of warbly strangeness. It's not being that extreme right now, which is kind of fun, but just know there's a potential loss of quality. And same thing when we go vice versa. If we were to leave the pitch as it is, this would be time stretching. So that was pitch shifting, and this would be time stretching. Here you'll probably hear the artifacts or loss of quality a little bit more. So I'm going to stretch this out in time, but leave the pitch the way it is. Here's the violin. So hear how the pitch is still pretty accurate and it is stretched out in time, but that sort of that sort of stuff, in fact, you can even see it, the sort of grid-like stuff, that's the loss of audio quality that I'm talking about. It has this kind of gritty stretchedness, which obviously could be fun or interesting if you're making glitchy music or just experimental music, or if you want this sound, but it's hard to avoid unless you just let yourself change the pitch as well. So there are other ways you could get around this by looping your sound if you're interested in stretching things out without actually losing the audio quality. But hopefully that makes sense why, because pitch and time are naturally connected. Either we change both or we change only one and know that our quality is compromised. Auto-tune, if you're familiar with that concept, is an example of pitch shifting, where we just pitch shift to the notes of a scale, and so you can just kind of do whatever and plug it into the auto-tune, and the auto-tune will change the pitches to some in tune pitches. All right, so that is all for our pitch and time effects. Another basic effect is panning. Panning is the term for moving sounds back and forth between the left and right speakers or the left and right ears of your headphones. So stereo sound is the name for when we have two speakers or two headphones. That's as opposed to mono. So mono and stereo. Here, I've been looking at mono to make things clearer, but now we can look at a stereo version of our file. Here it is in both ears with the same thing in both ears. I probably want to get rid of that time stretching, don't I? Okay. I should get rid of that time stretching. All right. So here we are in stereo. Right now we have the same thing in both ears. If you were to record a room or to record with two mics, you would naturally have something different in each ear. Right now what you see on the top here, and here I can select just the top, is the left ear, and down on the bottom is the right ear. So there are all sorts of interesting things we could do by shifting things to the left and right, but the simplest of them is panning. So if you were looking at a piece of audio equipment or a mixing program or something, you might have a panning knob that lets you pan things back and forth. In our case, we're just looking at a file. So in order to pan, what we would do is change the volume on both sides. So I could, for example, on the left ear, fade in, and on the right ear, fade out. And what we would hear is the sound sort of move from the right ear to the left. Sounds kind of long, so it's a little bit less extreme, but you can see that the volumes have changed in one ear versus the other. So that's panning. It's pretty simple. And let's go ahead and talk about the next of the basic effects, and the last one of my basic effect category, which is reversing. Also very simple, just means playing your sound backwards. So let's go ahead and just take the first couple, let's see, we can just get rid of the square wave. Oh, actually, we'll leave the square wave in. Okay, so we're going to reverse this whole thing. So I just go up and click reverse. Now this is played backwards. So you notice that you've probably heard this plenty of times before in different contexts. We do notice that I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the panning so things are just a little bit clearer. You notice that certain types of sounds, certain volumes and attacks of sounds come across differently when we reverse. The square wave is actually identical. It being so pure and perfect, like we talked about with its timbre, the fact that I'm playing it backwards doesn't really matter. It's actually the same thing. We take the sound of the flute, for example, and it actually sounds very similar because of the nature of blowing in and stopping the breath. It sounds a little bit different because when they first started blowing in, that was over here. But the start and end to the flute sound are not that much changed by reversing. Sort of similar with the bowing of this is the violin. But we do hear that little crunch at the end, which originally came at the beginning when the bow hit the string. So as you're bowing or blowing an instrument, while you're in the middle of that sound, you're doing something that's pretty much the same forward and backward. You remember how the timbres that we talked about we talked about how some of the sounds had a lot more activity at the very beginning, whereas others were pretty consistent throughout the sound. So that's coming to bear here in reversing. You can see these two sounds, which are the plucked and struck sounds. They obviously are quite different in reverse. So obviously they swell up in volume instead of naturally decaying, but also we hear when they get to the end, not just a stop, but like a sort of noisy rip of sound. And that's because when this gong was struck and when this guitar was plucked, at the very beginning was a kind of noisy pop, like a percussive sound. And that doesn't really sound that great in reverse. The rest of it sounds really cool though. Or rather, it just sounds a little harsh. So what you could do, if you're trying to create music with this kind of thing, you could have a forward version of the sound that comes in at the exact moment when the reversed version is complete. So something like, I didn't quite get it there, but something like this. And that would kind of take the edge off of that immediate stop. Another thing you could do would be to just use the resonance itself and just fade out your sound like this, so it's not as harsh when it cuts off. So working with reversed sounds is pretty fun. There's really not that much to learn about reversing, but as we talk a little bit about time-based effects in a minute, you'll see how that would they would be affected by reversing. So let's go ahead and go back to normal here and move on. So the next category of effects is effects that have to do with amplitude. Amplitude is basically the same as volume, so just think about volume effects. So the volume effects that we're going to cover are just three. There is the simplest one of them is normalize, and normalize is just an effect like turning something up. But when you turn something up really loud like this, and you look at the audio, it's gotten what we call clipped, and so it can't go any louder. And when it gets up that loud and it starts clipping, I don't really want to play this because I don't want to hurt our ears, but you've probably heard what this sounds like before. Not only is it very loud, but at the very top volumes it starts clipping off, and so what you get is something really harsh, and you hear these clicky clips. I'm trying to think, maybe I could this program is so nice that it doesn't let me chop off the audio like that. It's stopping me from clipping it. But basically you don't want to clip audio. So what normalize does is just takes wherever your volume started and it just naturally turns it up so that it gets to the loudest point and doesn't go over. So this just turned up, I normalized it, and the very loudest moment in the music right here is perfectly loud and everything else is adjusted. So normalize is a useful tool for amplifying so that the loudest moment is fully loud and it doesn't clip. The other two amplitude effects we're going to talk about are dynamic range effects. They're the compressor and the lesser used expander, which is just the opposite of the compressor. So the compression is a very simple concept. It's just rather tricky to get good at using it. So any of you who are interested in mixing music, you should definitely research how to do compression well. But a compressor is an effect that changes the volume of our sound based on some parameters so that the dynamic range is compressed. So it's not compressing the file, it's not compressing the pitch or timbre or anything like that. It's just compressing the dynamic range. So right now, what's a dynamic range? Right now we can see with this gong sample, that it involves a very loud moment. This is fully loud, and it goes all the way down to very, very quiet here. If you imagine yourself in a car and you're listening to a song and the song gets really quiet and you can't hear it, so you turn up the volume knob, and then now the loud section of the song comes in and it's too loud, so you turn back down the volume knob and you keep adjusting the volume knob so that you can hear the quiet stuff, but the loud stuff doesn't blow you away. That's what compression is. That's what a compressor does. It does it automatically for you. And so what it's going to do is, instead of having very, very loud and very, very quiet moments, we're going to compress the range so that instead of from loudest to quietest, it goes from medium loud to medium quiet. I did give some of the details on how to compress using the threshold, the ratio, and the makeup gain and the attack. But this is mostly for those of you who are interested in trying to work with compression. So I can just tell you how this works basically. What we're going to do is make the louds less loud. They'll still be loud, but not as loud. And then we will bring up the quiet stuff a little bit to compress the dynamic range. So there are a few different sort of interfaces for this. I think I'll just use one that looks like the old kind that we would have in hardware. So what I would do is, actually I should use one that shows you the graph. That's easier. So here on this graph, I'm taking, the graph is between the input volume and the output volume. So if the graph is like this, just a straight diagonal line, then nothing is changed. But these are the highest dynamics in the music. So these are the loudest moments up here. And let's say I do this and I just cut off the loudest moments and I make them all the same amount of loud. And then I go ahead and apply this. What you'll see is the loudest moments will still be loud, but just not as loud. They'll get rounded down. Okay, that did it with makeup gain. So it did it, and then it also turned everything up. So let me just change that. Yeah, maybe that was a little bit difficult to see, but it did work. Let's try it again and make sure my attack time is very fast. There we go. So this is a pretty extreme example. So now, like, notice how this, the gong still starts loud and gets quieter, but it just doesn't start nearly as loud. This is heavy compression like you hear on the radio, where all the volumes are pretty much the same. We probably would normally want something in the middle, so I'll just make this a little bit less extreme. And just think about it like this. We're just compressing the dynamic range so the louds aren't quite as loud. And what the makeup gain thing is now that the louds are quieter, I could make up some gain or make up some volume by turning everything up. So that's often what happens. And when you hear a pop or rock or any kind of album, maybe besides classical, what you hear is every sound is compressed like this, because in order to make a mix of good music come from a 1-inch or 5-inch speaker, you need to pack a whole band into a tiny amount of volume range. And so what you do is you compress all the instruments and their dynamic ranges. So we'll still hear something pretty similar right now from this gong, but it just won't be as extreme in the loud moment. Maybe I'll turn the whole thing down a little bit. Versus this. If you can't hear the subtle distinction, you can see it. It was just in the original, it's very, very loud like this, and the compressed version has a smaller dynamic range. So when you see compressor and expander, they're compressing or expanding the dynamic range. So an expander is not used nearly as often, but it's just the opposite of a compressor. Compressor compresses the dynamic range into a smaller range. The expander makes the dynamic range bigger. So if you had a really flat sound like an organ or like this, maybe this square wave, you might want to expand the sound. Or another way of saying it is if I've got this compressed sound here and I wanted to go back to the original, I might expand the dynamic range. I'm not really going to show that because it's just so much rarer. I just want you to know that it exists. The main thing to get out of this is the compressor, and it's compressing the dynamic range. So that was amplitude effects, and now we move on to time-based effects. So time-based effects are effects that affect the timing of the sound. So they are delay and echo and reverb. Those are the main ones we're going to be looking at in terms of time-based effects. So obviously the time stretch that we talked about earlier is a time-based effect as well. But these play with what happens in time. So we can start with the simplest of them, which is a delay. And a delay is, at the simplest level, just playing back your sound more than once after a delay. So that would be like if we had our sound here and then we just copied the sound again over here. Technically, that's a delay. It's the first sound, a delay, and then the sound again. Usually what happens is when the sound comes back, it's a little quieter, as if it were echoing off some distant wall or something. And usually it happens a little closer to the original sound. But this is basically a delay. So just like any effects, there are all these different sort of user interfaces for them that may look different. But we'll just go to a simple one here. This is a delay that is saying how many milliseconds do I want and what's my wet versus dry. So let's say I want 100 milliseconds of a delay, and I want the wet to be 50%. So let's see what that does. So you hear that 100 milliseconds is not long. That's a tenth of a second. So we hear right after the initial gong hit, another gong hit. Let's do it again with a little bit more space so we can hear it. So stretching this out to a full second or 1,000 milliseconds with a 50% wet dry. We hear the dry, the first hit was about the same volume as the delayed version. And there is another element that we can add to that delay, which is feedback. So feedback is a general term which means when information feeds back like from an output into an input. So in the case of a delay, when that happens, it turns into what we call an echo, which is just a related effect. So here is a delay and it has a feedback control. So that means that when we hear the first sound and it's delayed, and then both of those go back in and get delayed again. So we just have a feedback that happens for some amount of time. Let's see what happens with that. And there it went a little bit out of control, which is how feedback works. You have to be really careful with it. Let's see. I think I was going to use this one. So had a little too much feedback on there. And that's not quite enough. Last try. Okay, let's hear it. Okay, I think we just need a little bit more wet. So it just wasn't quite enough wet. Here we go. And maybe a little longer initial delay. So you hear the dry sound, the wet delayed sound, and then you hear both of them go back through the system and feed back. So that's an echo. I would say it's a type of delay. It's a delay with feedback. Um, so the other type of time effect that we're going to talk about is reverb. You probably know what reverb is. We speak of reverb both as a natural occurrence in a room or in a cave, and then we also speak of it as an effect. So if we were to go play this gong in a cave, we all know we would hear it um, coming back to us over and over again in the room, and that would be a reverb. It also is basically an echo. It's just that the effect, echo and delay, usually refer to longer delays. So a reverb is traditionally a very fast series of delays, like less than 50 milliseconds. So there can be some overlap between reverb and delay. But a reverb would be like having a lot of tiny delays. Like in a room, you have a bunch of walls, and we don't hear the sound come back quite as loud as we did in the delay, but we hear it come back based on how large the room is, how flat the walls are, etc. So I've given you a fair amount of information about about reverb. Um, and that's mostly to for those of you who are curious. For example, I gave these types of delays: room, hall, church, cathedral. You get the idea there. It's like a room is small, a hall is bigger, a church is really big, and a cathedral is huge, or there sometimes is tunnel or cave. Um, but the main thing I want you to know is that there are two basic types of uh, reverb. One is called algorithmic, and that just means that it's a reverb that is basically fake, that's created by a bunch of little algorithms or little programs that make the sound come back to emulate a room or a cave. So it's a fake cave made by tiny little delays. So in this, I could do that by going to reverb and a regular old cheap reverb delay. Let's put it through room ambience. Again, a little subtle. I want to kind of prove the points by making them pretty extreme here. So let's go more wet. Ooh, not that much. How about this? So we hear it last longer. We would also notice that certain parts of the spectrum are elongated more than others. That's kind of trying to emulate a room. So it's an algorithmic reverb. It's basically a cheap fake reverb. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's that's how reverbs worked for a very long time. The other type of reverb is called convolution reverb, and that's associated with IR, or an impulse response. And it's a really cool and more recent development, which is where folks actually go into real spaces like cathedrals and caves and make recordings of those spaces. And then we play our sound through that recording, or through the impulse response of that recording. So I have one here. It's this. So what I can do is go into an archive of, they're actually free, believe it or not, the impulse responses. I can go through real spaces, the London Arena, the St. Petersburg Synagogue. Let's pick that one. And it has recordings of different parts of that place. So I'm going to click that one. So now it's still going to sound like reverb. Actually, I need to get rid of the old reverb on this one, though. There we go. So it's still going to sound like reverb, but the difference is now it's taken from a real place with an impulse response. The way that works is they go into the space and they make a recording, but not a recording of music or a specific instrument. They make a recording of a giant blast of noise. Believe it or not, they actually usually do that with a pistol with a blank in it. It's kind of similar to clapping in a room. If we were to clap in a room, we would hear all of all the frequencies of the room respond. And so the very loud bang or cracking sound activates all the frequencies of the room, the resonant frequencies, the shape and size of the room. And then they take that recording, that impulse response recording, and we play our sound through that. So it's like we've sort of funneled the sound of this gong through a gunshot in a synagogue. Here's what it sounds like. Remember, we still have control over the parameters of these effects. So I can use a really large hall like this, but just have less wet. So that was 100% wet. What about if I wanted to hear this gong up close, but then also hear 20% of this giant synagogue? Let's hear that. Kind of beautiful and subtle. We could try it on the violin, since the violin might just show us a little bit more of what's happening in the reverb there. Let's try one more reverb option so we can go to a different kind of sound. Let's say something more like a skyscraper stairwell. And I will go with 50-ish% dry and wet. It actually does kind of sound like a stairwell. And so that's convolution reverb, or IR reverb. It involves an impulse response from a real place that we play our sound through. It's better quality, it's newer, it's more fun, and the algorithmic thing can be all right too because it's usually free. But just know there's a distinction not only of the quality of the program you're using, but the actual type of reverb, either being fake algorithmic or an impulse response convolution reverb. Now moving on to modulation effects. So modulation is where you modulate the sound in time. So it does affect timing as well, but it's a specific type of effect where you're modulating your sound usually with another sound. So we did talk about an LFO, or a low frequency oscillator, in the last lesson. And that's the same thing as a modulation effect. You probably remember that if we take just our normal sound of, like, let's say the square wave, when we put an LFO on it, a low frequency oscillator, remember this means very, very low, like 1 hertz, then we have modulated this every second. So the volume of this overall sound will change every second if it's modulating the volume. So we're going to talk about 2 options for modulation. One is tremolo, which is what I just said. It's an LFO that modulates the volume of a signal. That's called tremolo. That is a little bit slightly different than the term in classical music for tremolo. But tremolo as an effect is a modulation of the volume in time. So just think about it as kind of like what I was talking about with the compressor, where you were turning the volume knob in your car up and down. This would be like doing that, but every second, and not based on what is happening in the song. Just turning the volume knob up and down every second. Vibrato is the other type, where you truly do the same thing and you use an LFO to modulate, but instead the only difference is you're modulating the pitch. So instead of changing the volume, now you're changing the pitch, and that creates a vibrato effect. So instead of, like in this case, with the tremolo, we basically get, instead of ooh, we get ooh, 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 ooh. With vibrato, we get ooh. So we can go ahead and do those, and we can use, I'm trying to use kind of a mix of effects. so that you can see some different options. There we go. So this is another effect program that's modeled after an old hardware setup where you could have each piece of equipment in this rack. So we actually have versions of pretty much all the effects we've talked about over here that we could drag in and use this way. But it might be a little bit much right now. We can take this thing called the tremolator, and we can use this to make tremolo. So it says amplitude modulation. That's exactly what a tremolo is. So we have a control of the depth and the rate. Those are the main two elements. So I'm going to go ahead and play back our whole track here, and just as it plays, I'll change the tremolator settings. So we'll hear the depth is how much does it go from 0 volume to full volume, or does it just dip a little bit? And the rate is, of course, how fast the modulation is happening, or the speed of the LFO. So that's tremolo. Pretty simple. And if we wanted to do a vibrato, we would be doing the same thing, but just changing the pitch. So this has both vibrato and tremolo on it. So when we are talking about tremolo, it's a modulation of amplitude or volume. That's also known as AM, like in AM radio. AM radio is encoded with changes of volume or amplitude modulation. So tremolo is just like AM, amplitude modulation. Vibrato is FM, frequency modulation. So modulating the pitch or modulating the frequency. This little program here has the ability to do both at once, which might be a bit much. Let's go ahead and just do the frequency modulation, and I will move up the depth and change the speed here. You can see it gets pretty crazy as I move the hertz up, but maybe I want to modulate by only just a little bit. I want to just have a little tiny vibrato. Let's try that. And like I said, we could have both at once, where we're modulating the amplitude and the frequency. So that's a tremolo and vibrato. I wasn't too thrilled with the results, but it shows you how it works. So those are modulation effects, where modulation is changing something in time, usually controlled with an LFO or low frequency oscillator. And now we move on to our last section for this lesson. The last category for our purposes for effects is audio quality effects. And we're actually really only going to talk about one major type of audio quality effects. But you noticed earlier I was talking about how when you pitch or time stretch and you don't change the other one, you end up with some degradation of audio quality. There are other effects that could degrade audio quality on purpose, but the main thing we're going to talk about is distortion. Distortion is probably the most common effect there is. I held up my distortion pedal earlier. I grew up in the 1990s where every time we got to the chorus of a song, we turned on the distortion. And sometimes we turned on the distortion at 8 a.m. and never turned it off. So distortion is extremely common. And it's really rather interesting in terms of what it's doing and what the effect is, both on the timbre and the sound. So if you don't know the sound of distortion, let's go ahead and check it out, and then I'll explain what it is. Let's listen to the violin and the guitar. The violin still has that nifty synagogue on it, so we'll just leave that on. But we've got this nice dry guitar right here. And I can pull up this effect rack that we've been looking at, and instead of using the tremolator, I can use something called the decapitator. So the decapitator not only is trying to sound hardcore, but it actually gets at what distortion really is, as you'll see here. It's talking about cutting the highest part of the sound off on purpose. Earlier I talked about how we don't want signals to clip. Distortion actually does that on purpose, but it does it in a controlled and hopefully pleasing sounding way, not by accident by turning up the sound too loud. So let's go ahead and try this decapitator, similar to a distortion pedal. The drive is the main control. That just means how much distortion. It's essentially like how much distortion are we putting on. I'll explain a little more in a moment. So this is an interesting one where where our different sounds reacted pretty differently to this distortion. So let's explain a little bit about what that sound is, what it's doing. So this is a pretty good graph. This is in your reading. It shows this is the original signal, and what distortion is doing is clipping it off. And you see this is called soft clipping, where it's kind of like compression, but it's more deeply affecting the sound than compression. It's not just changing the long-term overall ups and downs of the sound. It's really cutting into the sound or clipping the sound. You can see this one says hard clipping, where you see they're more squared off. That would be an even more extreme type of clipping. So what you're doing is essentially cutting off the edges of the highs and lows of the sound, and that creates this distorted signal, which makes it noisier, and it's a little bit hard to describe. It makes it noisier, raunchier, and louder, and it's one of the effects that sounds best actually in analog, and it's why a lot of people like to use tube amplifiers that are, still have a real vacuum tube in them, that when you distort them, it can only go so far and it sounds warm. I'm probably going too far into that, but the distortion, you probably want to go with a pedal or an amp rather than a program like this, than a digital program, unless you know what you're doing. Anyway, that's a side note. So here, let's check this out again. That's my guitar with a bunch of distortion on. I'm going to get rid of this one, and we'll see the decapitator a little better here. This has different settings. It's basically a different sound to it. So the drive is basically how much we're cranking up the sound before cutting it off. let's see, can I go ahead and apply this effect? So let's look at our sounds here, and I'm going to go ahead and apply the effect so that it changes our actual waveforms there. Yeah, look at this now. And this. So like I said, it is similar to compression in that you notice the dynamic range is compressed, but the goal is different. Here we really wanted a different sound. With compression, we were sort of sneakily just trying to make it have a smaller dynamic range. Here you can see the waves are sort of warped. That's called DC offset here, where it's sort of warped onto one side. I wanted to look both at this and at the spectrum, because here's where we'll really see what distortion does. So I'm going to go back to the dry, unaffected sound here. And let's look at that spectrum. So here's the guitar. And now let's go ahead and put the distortion back on. Look what happened. So everything's brighter, obviously it's louder, but notice what happened with the harmonics. You can see all of our sounds here. I'll go back. Here's the unaffected dry. Look at the flute. Now what happened with all of its harmonics when we put the distortion on? It's not only louder, but every harmonic got louder. And that's probably the best way to explain what distortion does. As you clip off the waveform like that, it has the effect of making everything more harmonically rich, or making all the harmonics or partials louder. Look at the gong, it got really crazy. As we keep filling up the spectrum with more and more harmonics, we're getting closer to noise. So this one's getting pretty close to noise. You hear that sort of kind of sound. So that's what distortion looks like in the audio spectrum. And for the very last thing for this lesson, I wanted to bring up something that's just kind of fun, and that's downsampling or bit crushing. It's a type of distortion that allows you to, on purpose, change the audio quality so that it goes back to a lesser audio quality. I will show that here in Logic. Sampling and bit crushing are types of distortion, so they still crunch the sound down like this, but they do it in a very harsh way where it reduces the sound quality, so that you get kind of glitchy or lo-fi sound. It can kind of emulate early video game sounds by going back to 8-bit from our normal 16 or 24-bit. So I've pulled up our same sounds in Logic here. Here's our flute, for example. And here is the bit crusher. So you can see if we start with high resolution, this is like a normal distortion that I'll be adding here. It's a kind of low quality, regular distortion. I've driven it a lot there. I'm going to turn it back down. So we're adding volume to the sound and clipping it on purpose. So I'm going to turn it back down here a bit. And now I'm going to play with the resolution. So I'm going to go from this fantastic digital quality of 24-bit, and I'm going to go down to less bits. Down all the way toward 1-bit, you'll see. It's almost like we've disappeared into a robotic place here, because it's crunching the sound so much you can almost not even hear it anymore. We do still have control of the wet dry though, so maybe we want a little bit of this crazy buzziness. I'm going to go back up to, let's say, 4-bit, and now I'm going to do the downsampling. So the resolution reduced the bit depth, so it reduced the audio quality that way. The downsampling would be like going to an even worse sampling rate. You might remember when we talked about sampling, how loud are you now? How loud are you now on our audio, creating the little dots that are recreated by our DAC to produce the sound. Now on purpose, we're downsampling 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and see how it's making this wonky looking um, squared off version of the sine wave over there. That's what we're going to be doing. So it's just going to be a really poor representation of our sound on purpose. Let's try it. Well, I think that's a good place to end today. So go ahead and review all of these effects in the reading. Let me know if you have questions. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed learning about audio effects today. And as we transition out of Module 3, we're also ending Unit 1. So Unit 1, we explored the definition of music and its relationship to nature and ourselves, as well as the tools of creating music, like instruments and effects. When we go into Unit 2, starting next lesson, we're going to be starting to explore the elements of music, the rhythm, the pitch, scales, melody, harmony, and form. So we're really going to now dive into the inside of music starting in the next module. See you then.